Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So today we're going to go into um, Wilber again. And we're going to go through part one, which is the problem, right? Chapter two, a deadly dance, the relation of science and religion in today's world. So before I begin reading the chapter, I found this. Oh man, yeah, that works. So we're gonna listen to this short clip I got off one of my Telegram subscriptions. Kind of puts the issue in the forefront from a different perspective.
People talk glibly about science. What is science? People coming out of a university with a master's degree or a PhD, you take them into the field and they literally don't believe anything unless there's a peer-reviewed paper. It's the only thing they accept. And you say to them, but let's observe, let's think, let's discuss. They don't do it. It's just, is it in a peer-reviewed paper or not? That's their view of science. I think it's pathetic. Gone into universities as bright young people, they come out of them brain dead, not even knowing what science means. They think it means peer-reviewed papers, etc. No, that's academia. And if a paper is peer-reviewed, it means everybody thought the same, therefore they approved it. An unintended consequence is that when new knowledge emerges, new scientific insights, they can never, ever be peer-reviewed. So we're blocking all new advances in science that are big advances. If you look at the breakthroughs in science, almost always they don't come from the center of that profession. They come from the fringe. The finest candle makers in the world couldn't even think of electric lights. They don't come from within. They often come from outside the breaks. We're going to kill ourselves because of stupidity.
All right. So, with the rise of modernity and the collapse of the great nest of being, science and religion began an antagonistic dance. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that science and religion entered into a fierce and complex war between a pre-modern and mythological orientation to the universe and a thoroughly tough-minded and modern gaze, rational in its aspirations. In the wake of modernity, in the wake, that is, of the multifarious events, multifarious means many different, generally associated with the 18th century Enlightenment and often continuing today, events we will examine in Chapter 4, there arose 4 or 5 major stances toward the relation of science and religion. These stances are still with us, and they will dominate the discussion about science and spirituality. Yet all of them have substantial, even severe limitations. Nonetheless, we can learn much from both their strengths and their weaknesses, their contributions and their flaws. In particular, understanding why these attempts have largely failed and continue to fail will help us zero in on the precise requirements of this difficult marriage. So the first stance is that science denies any validity to religion. This is the standard empirical and positivist approach, which became, in numerous guises, the dominant official mood of modernity. Classic variations on this theme have been given by Auguste Comte, Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx, and Bertrand Russell, but they all boil down to religion as a hangover from the childhood of humanity, on exactly the same footing as the tooth fairy. It's cute for kids, but deadly for adults. And its persistence into maturity, the persistence of deeply held religious beliefs into adulthood, is a sign of pathology. lack of logical clarity, or existential inauthenticity. There are no exceptions because there is no God, and there is no God because science registers that which is real, and no microscope and no telescope have yet spotted any God. All right? So science denies any validity to religion. It's kind of like on the extreme side of one of the poles, right? Now, the other one is religion denies any validity to science. That's the second stance. This is a typically fundamentalist retort to modernity and is itself a byproduct of modernity. By and large, classical religions never denied science. Hold on one second. Okay, let's start over. Religion denies any validity to science. So that's the second stance. So there's a typically fundamentalist retort to modernity, and is itself a byproduct of modernity. By and large, classical religions never denied science. First, because science was not a threat. Only with modernity does science become powerful enough to kill God. And second, because science was always held to be one of several valid modes of knowing, subservient to spiritual modes, but valid nonetheless, and hence there was no reason to deny its importance. At the same time, it should be noted that the sciences of antiquity were not nearly as impressive as what a Newton, a Galileo, or a Kepler would deliver, and thus few were the temptations to make science itself a new religion of positivism, which is exactly what Auguste Comte would propose, with Comte himself volunteering to be literally the Pope of positivism. In any event, science in the pre-modern world had little inclination to deny religion, and thus a drastic counterforce was uncalled for. But with the rise of modernity and its inherent claim that all religions are childish productions, many fundamentalist religions, especially Christianity and Islam, began to deny the basic facts of science itself. Evolution does not exist. The Earth was literally created in 6 days. Radiocarbon dating is a fraud, and so on. So the third stance is science is but one of several valid modes of knowing, and thus can peacefully coexist with spiritual modes. This is an interesting one. All right. This was the standard position of most classical religions and the religions of antiquity. In fact, this is just another way of describing the great chain of being. And okay, just another way of explaining the great chain of being. Although this view, which is now generally called epistemological pluralism, was the backbone of the great wisdom traditions, it collapsed with the great chain upon which it depended. All right, so this is hard stuff to get through. So let's keep trudging ahead. When modernity rejected the great chain, it simultaneously rejected epistemological pluralism. And modernity continues to reject epistemological pluralism in any of its forms because modernity most definitely continues to reject the great chain. All right, we got through that. Nonetheless, for those scholars, theorists, and intelligent laypeople attempting to make sense of the universe in some sort of holistic or encompassing fashion, epistemological pluralism has remained one of the more appealing and sophisticated attempts to unite science and religion. Modernity itself aggressively discarded this view, but what we might call counter-modernity or the counterculture never much more than a small percentage of the total population, but one desperately looking for a way to heal modernity's fragmentations would nevertheless continue to look to epistemological pluralism as one of the most refined and compelling ways to proceed. The traditional view of epistemological pluralism was given perhaps its clearest statement by such Christian mystics as Saint Bonaventure and Hugh of Saint Victor. Every human being has the eye of flesh, the eye of mind, and the eye of contemplation. Each of these modes of knowing discloses its own corresponding dimension of being, the gross, the subtle, and the causal, and thus each is valid and important when addressing its own realm. This gives us a balance of empirical knowledge, science, rational knowledge, logic and mathematics, and spiritual knowledge. So, just to review that sentence, this gives us a balance of empirical knowledge, which is science, rational knowledge, logic and mathematics, and spiritual knowledge, gnosis. It's kind of funny how those three things he mentions kind of align with the Buddha's 3 levels of wisdom, right? Empirical knowledge, science, that's awareness. Rational knowledge, logic and mathematics, that's intellectual inquiry. And spiritual knowledge, gnosis, that's knowing, that's experiential, right? The 3 eyes of knowing are, of course, just a simplified version of the universal great chain of being. If we picture the great chain as having 5 levels, matter, body, mind, soul, and spirit, men and women have 5 eyes available to them: material prehension, bodily emotion, mental ideas, the soul's archetypal cognition, and spiritual gnosis. Likewise, if the great chain is divided into 12 levels, we have 12 eyes or 12 levels of awareness and knowing. Indeed, Platonius, arguably the greatest philosopher mystic the world has ever known, usually gave the great chain 12 levels: matter, life, sensation, perception, impulse, images, concepts, logical faculty, creative reason, world soul, nous, and the one. So table 2.1, and I took a picture of the table, shows the typical great nest is presented by Platonius and Sri Aurobindo, 2 of its greatest representatives. The match between them is quite striking and fairly typical. The point is that any way we slice the great pie, 3 levels, 5 levels, 12 levels, or more, men and women have available to them at least 3 basic eyes of knowing: the eye of flesh, empiricism, the eye of mind, rationalism, and the eye of contemplation, mysticism, each of which is important and quite valid when dealing with its own level, but gravely confused if it attempts to see into other domains. This is the very heart of epistemological pluralism, and as far as it goes, it is indeed quite valid. Now, if the existence of all 3 eyes of knowing were a commonly accepted fact in modernity, the relation of science and religion and their peaceful coexistence would be no problem whatsoever. Empirical science would pronounce on the facts delivered by the eye of flesh, and religion would pronounce on the facts delivered by the eye of spirit, or the eye of contemplation. But mainstream modernity has soundly and thoroughly denied reality to the eye of spirit. Modernity recognizes only the eye of reason yoked to the eye of flesh. In Whitehead's phrase, the dominant worldview of modernity is scientific materialism, and whether that science be the holistic science of systems theory or the subatomic physics of quantum events, science is the eye of reason linked to the evidence offered by the empirical senses. In no case is the eye of contemplation or the eye of spirit required or even allowed. The real difficulty, then, is not showing how empiricism, rationalism, and mysticism can all fit together in the great chain of being. It is not showing how they can all be harmoniously integrated in a great spectrum of consciousness. It is not demonstrating that such a synthesis is coherent and complete, for that, in a sense, is the easy part. All of those statements, I believe, are true. The hard part is that modernity does not accept the higher levels themselves, the transmental, transrational, transpersonal, and contemplative modes, and thus it sees no need whatsoever for the integration. Why try to integrate science and Santa Claus? Thus, arguing for epistemological pluralism and the different eyes of knowing, or modes of inquiry, is at best a first step. The real problem is that modernity does not accept the terms to be integrated in the first place. We will therefore have to find another path into the heart of modernity if any integration of science and religion is ever to take root in the West. All right, so let's move on to the fourth stance. Science can offer plausibility arguments for the existence of spirit. This is a variation on epistemological pluralism, but because it has recently generated much interest among professionals and lay people alike, I will discuss it separately. The idea is that as empirical science pushes into the deepest secrets of the physical world, it discovers facts and data that seem to demand some sort of intelligence beyond the material domain. The standard example is the Big Bang. Where did that come from? Since the very earliest material plasma seems to have been obeying mathematical laws that they themselves did not come into being with the Big Bang, must not those laws exist in the mind of some eternal spirit? As Sir Arthur Eddington, echoing Berkeley, suggested, these laws, all agree, existed prior to space and time. Thus, to the question, what existed before the Big Bang, the answer very well might be a non-material logos governing the patterns of creation, what many would simply call God. And this argument continues since science discovered the Big Bang. Science itself is pointing to God. There are numerous variations on this argument, most of which are twists on the traditional argument from design, namely that incredibly intelligent natural designs demand an incredibly intelligent something or other behind them. There's a very old argument stretching back at least to early Greece that has been aggressively attached to recent advances in the sciences, particularly quantum relativistic systems and complexity theories. This approach is perhaps the simplest and most popular of ways in which an alienated counter-modernity has attempted to integrate science and religion. We see it in everything from the Tao of physics, which maintains that modern physics discloses a worldview similar to that of Eastern mysticism, to the thoughtful writings of Paul Davies, The Mind of God, which maintains that by the means of science, we can truly see into the mind of God. To the anthropic principle, and I found a little picture on the anthropic principle, which maintains that the evolution of human beings is so improbable that the universe must have known what it was doing from the very start, to the new holistic paradigm approaches, which maintain that systems theory is demonstrating the same great web of life that the holistic spiritual traditions embraced. I have a great deal of sympathy for many of the plausibility arguments. They are suggestive, they are indicative, they are certainly entertaining, but alas, none of them can stand up to the critical philosophy of, say, Immanuel Kant or the Buddhist genius Nagarjuna, both of whom strongly demonstrated the limits of rationality in the face of the divine. If deeply spiritual Nagarjuna is unswayed by these plausibility arguments, How must they go over with non-spiritual types? This is why the vast majority of scientists and modernity itself tend to take those arguments with mild interest at best, wild amusement at worst. The real problem with these rational, mental, or linguistic plausibility arguments is that they are attempting to use the eye of mind to see that which can be seen only with the eye of contemplation. The confusion of levels, which is called a category error, is particularly fatal when it comes to arguments for the existence of spirit. It was precisely these inadequate and altogether unconvincing mental attempts to storm the spiritual palace that made modernity look with suspicion on any and all claims to be able to prove the existence of God. These arguments and proofs are simply not compelling to the modern mind, and to the spiritual mind, they are inherently inadequate anyway. In no case, then, do these arguments deliver what they aspire to deliver, namely any sort of actual spiritual knowledge. Martin Gardner's response to these arguments is quite typical. Referring to the anthropic principle, Gardner points out that according to its adherents, it comes in four successive forms, each stronger in its claims. The weak anthropic principle, or WAP, the universe allows us to exist. The strong anthropic principle, or SAP, the existence of life explains the laws of the universe. The participatory anthropic principle, or PAP, conscious observers are necessary to bring the universe into existence. And the final anthropic principle, you guessed it, FAP, if life or consciousness ends, the universe will evaporate. To this list, Gardner, speaking for modernity, adds the completely ridiculous anthropic principle, or CRAP, any who buy the first four. So moving on to now the fifth stance. Science itself is not knowledge of the world, but merely an interpretation of the world, and therefore it has the same validity, no more, no less, as poetry and the arts. Because science refused to gracefully take its place as one among many other valid modes of knowing, this approach attempted to cripple science in its very foundations, pulling it down against its will. It tried to level the playing field by shooting science in the head and proclaiming, "There, now we're equal." This approach is, of course, the essence of postmodernism. It says, in effect, that the world is not perceived, it is only interpreted. Different interpretations are equally valid ways of making sense of the world, and thus no interpretation is intrinsically better than another. Science is not a privileged conception of the world, but merely one among many equivalent interpretations. Science does not offer quote-unquote truth, but simply its own favorite prejudice. Science is not a set of universal facts, but merely an arbitrary imposition of its own power drives. And in all cases, science is no more grounded in reality than is any other interpretation. So that epistemologically speaking, there is little difference between science and poetry, logic and literature, history and mythology, fact. Thus, this postmodern view continues. Science is not governed by facts, it's governed by paradigms. And paradigms are not much more than ad hoc constructions or free-floating interpretations. As we will see in the next chapter, the notion that science is governed by paradigms was made popular by Thomas Kuhn in his now famous The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which the postmodernists seized with a fury. Yet this is not at all the way Kuhn defined or described paradigms. and he strenuously denounced this abuse of his work to no avail. But according to this Miss Kuhnian notion of paradigm, science is not conforming itself to actual facts. It is simply imposing its paradigms on the world at large. Since independent facts do not exist, only interpretations do, it follows, according to this account, that science is always driven by some sort of power or ideology. Science itself is sexist, racist, ethnocentric, imperialistic, brutally imposing its analytical and divisive interpretations on an unwilling and innocent world. And it has no more warrant, no more final validity than any other poetic interpretation. Science, reduced to poetry, this is now the dominant route taken by the counterculture world in an attempt to reduce the monster of science to manageable proportions. I just got to interject here. I mean, the reason we're looking at science and religion, it kind of is a great metaphor for the Great Reset and the Great Awakening. It's a great metaphor for those who, the intelligent design versus evolution, those kind of things. That's where the chasm is. All right, continuing on. The postmodern attack on science, which attempts to shatter its epistemological foundations, is the reigning model of how to counter science in the postmodern world. It is crucial to understand this postmodern attempt to level science and thus make room for other paradigms, whether poetry, religion, mysticism, astrology, holism, post-structuralism, neo-paganism, or whatnot. Aside from its important moments of truth, which I will highlight and incorporate, this entire postmodern attempt is nonetheless profoundly misguided and deeply confused. In attempting to shoot science in the head, it simply kills that which it should be integrating. It denies that which should be embraced. It sabotages the desired wedding by murdering one of the spouses. Yet this postmodern attempt to see science as paradigm bound and thus rush in to offer a new paradigm is at the core of virtually every alternative countercultural and new paradigm approach to science and religion. The idea is that science is undergoing a paradigm shift of momentous proportions, and this new paradigm is in fact commensurate with spiritual realities. The new paradigm, it is claimed, will therefore unite science and religion for the first time in history, thus heralding the beginning of a world transformation, global in its sweep, that will usher in the beginning of a holistic, unified web of life world. And almost all of that, we will see, is based on a complete misreading of Thomas Kuhn. So the last part of this chapter, Wilber offers a possible solution. In the following chapters, I will argue that all 5 of those stances towards science and religion and their possible integration are inadequate. The first 2 stances, science denies religion, religion denies science, are obviously not going to be integrative. But the other 3, epistemological pluralism, plausibility arguments, and postmodern paradigm, have not proven powerful enough to integrate science and religion in a fashion that both parties find acceptable. Okay, I'm going to stop right here and just say, well, there's a thing called a BATNA, which is a best alternative to a non-negotiated agreement. Maybe there isn't a way to integrate science and religion. In other words, I would offer a 5th stance, which is each go their own way. Kind of like, well, if we go back to the very first slide in the kind of like the Great Awakening or the Great Reset. All right, but we'll continue with integrating, because you know what? The idea in the spiritual realm is unity. As I'll talk further later on, I don't see it so much as unity unifying or integrating two separate things. I see it more as non-dualism, which is different. All right. So we have seen that the only way we can possibly integrate science and religion is by integrating the great chain with the major differentiations of modernity. This specific integration is where all of those stances tend to fail. Yet, it is this approach that will very likely contain the central solution. Let us use as a brief example epistemological pluralism, which, as we saw, is by far the most sophisticated of the alternatives. And this traditional view, in the traditional view of epistemological pluralism, science is placed on the bottom rung of the great hierarchy. In this view, recall, science gives us the facts of the sensory level, the eye of flesh. Above that are the art, morals, and logic of the mental realms, the eye of mind, and above that, the religion and mysticism of the spiritual realms, the eye of contemplation. Science is relegated to low man on the totem pole, a role that modern science has utterly refused to accept, and in fact will not accept, which is precisely why this traditional epistemological pluralism cannot command the respect or the cooperation of modern science. But in a more sophisticated integration, each of those levels, sensory, mental, spiritual, is also divided according to the differentiations of modernity, art, morals, and science. Thus, and I must put this very loosely for an introductory statement, there are the art and morals and science of the sensory realm, the art and morals and science of the mental realm, and the art and morals and science of the spiritual realm. It is exactly this type of synthesis, should it prove sound, that would indeed satisfy both the core claim of spirituality, namely the great chain, and the core claim of modernity, namely the differentiation of the value spheres. Here, science, far from being on the bottom rung, has a great hand to play in accessing each of the levels of the great chain, from the lowest to the highest. Sensory science, mental science, spiritual science. It is not that spirituality takes up where science leaves off, but that they both develop up the great chain together. Science is not under, but alongside, and this profoundly reorients the knowledge quest, placing pre-modernity and modernity hand in hand in the quest for the real, and thus bringing science and religion together in a most intimate embrace. So this is an introduction to Ken Wilber's 4 quadrants. I mean, if you want to delve deeper, you can, of course, search Ken Wilber's 4 quadrants, but it's really this is his master map of his theory of everything, his toe. Okay, until next time.